Joining me now, our MSNBC political analyst Peter Beinart, editor-at-large at Jewish Current and author of Beinart Notebook on Substack. We also have Yousef Munayyer, senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and head of the center's Palestine-Israel program. Peter, let me start with you. What was your reaction to the news that Biden is agreeing to nominate Elliott Abrams to a foreign policy advisory position? Did your jaw stay closed? Because mine didn't.
It's chilling, and it's chilling even because this is not an important position. This is the reason it's chilling. Elliott Abrams, par excellence, was the American foreign policy figure who used the language of democracy and human rights to justify the most hideous human rights abuses by anyone who was on America's side in the Cold War. He was not like Henry Kissinger, who talked in the language of realpolitik. He talked about democracy and human rights, all the while he was apologizing for and arming people who were committing war crimes and even genocide. In Guatemala, the leader was convicted of, was accused by a Human Rights Commission of genocide. So now we're in a new Cold War. In which the U.S. is already sorely tempted to basically call itself the champion of democracy, to try to make it look good vis-a-vis China and excuse everything that a country that's on our side against China and Russia does. For instance, Narendra Modi coming to Washington and being celebrated, even though he is moving to India away from being a democracy and committing terrible human rights abuses there. So when you bring Elliott Abrams in, it's a signal that you're going to do this again. You're going to talk about democracy and human rights and excuse and even support the most hideous abuses of people on our side.
And Peter, just sticking with this issue before we move on to the Israel-Palestine issue, earlier this year you praised Ilhan Omar's foreign policy stances in the New York Times, saying that when she was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, she asked the questions that non-Americans might ask, were they seated across from the officials who direct America's awesome power? She translates between Washington and the outside world. More often than not, she does so alone. Isn't the problem in U.S. foreign policy, Peter, that people like Elliott Abrams still thrive and people like Ilhan Omar don't?
Absolutely, because Ilhan Omar actually believes in human rights. She believes in it when they're violated by America's adversaries, and she believes in it in the cases where they're done by America's friends and America itself, because we have even more responsibility for that. And people like Elliott Abrams don't. They only talk about human rights as a language to justify whatever is done in the name of America's superpower, great power interests. And it's tragic that in a democratic administration that Ilhan Omar's voice is silenced and Elliott Abrams is elevated.
Yes. Yousef, let's talk about the big story in the Middle East this week, the Israeli attack on Jenin, or what they call a counter-terror operation against militants hiding there. Have a listen to what former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said to the BBC about the killing of Palestinian kids in Jenin.
You are calling them terrorists. The UN are calling them children.
No, I'm actually asking you, what would you call a 17-year-old person with a rifle shooting at your family and murdering your own family? How would you define that person?
What is your response, Yousef, to Naftali Bennett and that common Israeli line of argument? What's your answer to his question? Because their argument is, well, if they're armed, it doesn't matter that they're under 18.
Well, that's certainly not where the international law is on these issues and the definition of a child either. And of course, we know that so many Palestinian children have been killed or injured by Israeli troops who have not been armed and who have had nothing to do with armed resistance. A few weeks ago, there was a 2-year-old Palestinian child who was shot by an Israeli sniper when he was entering a car along with his father. Look, the abuses of Palestinian children by the Israeli military and the forces of Israeli occupation have been extensively documented by human rights groups, large and small. So, you know, look, the Israeli military and their representatives, officials, anytime there is a major military operation, whether it's in the Jenin refugee camp or in Gaza, go into full public diplomacy mode, and you know you have to take everything that they say with a great degree of skepticism. We saw that, of course, under Naftali Bennett's government when he put out a video after the Israeli military shot and killed Shireen Abu Akleh, blaming the Palestinians for killing her, which we very quickly learned was not the case, and that the Israeli soldiers were responsible for it. So anytime there is an operation like this, the Israelis understand that global public opinion is opposed to and is in fact horrified by the enforcement of occupation and apartheid against the Palestinian people. And so they again go into crisis mode in public diplomacy to try to create an impression that they are defending themselves. But you don't defend yourself against people you're colonizing and occupying. That simply is not the way that it works.
And Peter, you recently tweeted this week that the people in Jenin can't become citizens of the country in which they live, can't vote for the government that determines if they live or die, can't return to the lands from which their families were expelled. This underlies everything happening now. The American press rarely mentions it. I mean, it's the American press and the American government, too. It's Congress as well.
Yes, and because this context is not mentioned, that's why people like Naftali Bennett can say, well, what would you do if a guy with a gun was threatening you? As if this just emerges because Palestinians just like to carry guns and threaten people because that's kind of the way they are, right? The critical context is that they are being denied the most basic rights: citizenship in the country in which they live, the right to vote for the government that has life and death power over them. And so when you hold people under that, that is a system of daily violence. This is what Martin Luther King said again and again and again when he talked about Black resistance in the United States. So if you want to stop violence and keep Israelis safe and keep Palestinians safe, you have to give people basic rights. If you viciously repress them violently, some of them are going to respond violently. And that's the context that should always be present in these conversations, but so often it's not.
Yusuf, among the 21st century American presidents, Bill Clinton, well, the end of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald J. Trump, Joe Biden, where do you rank President Biden when it comes to America and Israel?
It's hard to actually put a ranking on him because it's hard to really understand what his policy is. This administration has largely been hands off when it comes to Israel, which has meant that it has allowed the Israeli government to effectively do what it pleases. It's toned down criticism of Israeli settlement expansion, even though it is run amok. American citizens are being targeted by Israeli settlers in places like Tormos Aya, where settler violence has targeted their property and burnt down their homes. And this administration has been defensive of the Israeli government. An American citizen journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, was shot and killed by the Israeli military. And it's hard to describe the Biden administration's response to that as anything but complicit in covering up the crime of killing an American citizen, because they went to great lengths to ensure that the truth about that situation did not come out, and they're still doing so. And so, a lot of American presidents have left much to be desired when it comes to a fair foreign policy towards the Palestinians. But this administration, especially at a time when we are seeing growing criticism and change really in the Democratic Party, this administration seems to be particularly distant from where it should be when it comes to Palestinian rights.
And Yusuf, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, recently tweeted this video of himself visiting IDF soldiers, smiling with them, wishing them well. It's not really a surprise, then, that the U.S. government has not been able to get accountability for Shireen Abu Akleh if this is how the U.S. ambassador to Israel behaves with Israel's military.
In fact, that tweet of him celebrating with Israeli soldiers came just days after Israeli settlers protected by that very military rampaged in a Palestinian village where most of the people who live there are Palestinian Americans. They burnt down their homes and their cars in one of the many vicious attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in the last several months. Look, the United States is fully involved in this issue through its financing of the Israeli military, with the largest single chunk of the American foreign military financing program going to the Israeli military at some $3.8 billion a year. We are fully invested, not in peace, unfortunately, not in justice, but in the Israeli occupation and the continued policies of apartheid against the Palestinians.
And Peter, on the one hand, as Yusuf mentioned, we see polls of Democratic Party voters, US Jews, showing more and more support for Palestinians and Palestinian rights. We see the Squad in Congress calling out Israel's occupation. So it looks like we're making progress, but then when mass violence breaks out, like we saw this past week, in general, American politicians, including congressional Democrats, including some self-styled progressives, by and large fall in line with Israel. Is that ever going to change, do you think?
I think we need to make it change. And part of it, there has to be a mass movement. The United States really never sticks up for human rights of anybody in countries that we have a geopolitical connection to, unless a mass movement of Americans of conscience force them to. That's what happened in the Vietnam War, in the protests against the Vietnam War. It's happened in the anti-apartheid movement. It happened in the movement in the 1980s. One of the reasons that Elliott Abrams had to lie about and secretly aid military to the Contras is that there was a mass movement against Contra aid among people who knew that that was ruining Nicaragua. So we need another movement again. It needs to have Jews in it and Palestinians and people of good conscience who believe that there should be equality in Israel-Palestine, the same thing that we're struggling for in the United States. And the United States should be on that side of the struggle, not the current side that it's on.
And Peter, before we run out of time, I just want to turn to the war in Ukraine. NBC News reported today that former U.S. officials have held secret talks with Russians about the outlines of a possible end to the war, not at the direction of the Biden administration, but at least with their knowledge. Do you think that'll temper any criticism, especially from the left, that the White House isn't doing more to identify a potential exit strategy?
I think this is good. I mean, it seems to me what's going to happen is the Biden administration is probably going to try to see how far the Ukrainians can get with this counteroffensive to see it. And that's I think that's understandable. The Ukrainians are legit. They have a righteous cause here. It is not right for Russia to be controlling their territory. We should support them in getting as much of it back as we can that is possible. And then we should try to end the war. And I think the Biden administration, I am glad to see the Biden administration maybe moving in that direction.
Yusuf, 30 seconds left. Last word to you. Is it strange to live in a world where we simultaneously glorify Ukrainians violently resisting Russian occupiers as freedom fighters while condemning Palestinians violently resisting Israeli occupiers as terrorists?
Of course it is. Unfortunately, it's the world that we do find ourselves in. But that hypocrisy, I think, explains what we were all shocked about at the beginning of this segment, which is the appointment of someone like Elliott Abrams. This hypocrisy has been sown deep into the Biden administration's policy and the complete contrast between the way we are treating Ukrainians fighting against Russian occupation versus the way we are supporting Israeli occupation against Palestinians here in the United States, I think highlights that hypocrisy quite clearly.
Peter Beinart, Yusuf Munayyer, thank you both.